My mom is pressuring me to marry my abusive stepbrother and have his child, harasses me at work, and deceives me about my inheritance. I've had a tumultuous relationship with my mother ever since I was a child, but what's happening now is beyond anything I could have imagined. Growing up, the dynamic in our household was painfully clear. My stepbrother Brandon, 10 years older than me, was her golden child, the sun around which my mother's world revolved. He could do no wrong in her eyes, no matter how cruel or disgusting his behavior was. Meanwhile, I was the scapegoat, the afterthought, the one who could never measure up. Brandon wasn't just a bully, he was something far worse. He tormented me relentlessly, his cruelty escalating as we grew older. When I was 7, he'd steal my toys and hide them, laughing as I cried and tore the house apart looking for them. By the time I was 10, he graduated to cruel pranks, locking me in closets, ruining my school projects, and calling me names so vile that even now, as an adult, I hesitate to repeat them. I tried to tell my mother about his behavior, but it was like talking to a wall. Boys will be boys, she'd say dismissively, or worse, she'd accuse me of exaggerating. You must have provoked him, she'd add, turning her disapproval toward me. I learned quickly that there was no point in seeking her protection. By the time I was a teenager, Brandon's behavior had crossed into dangerous territory. He'd corner me in rooms, his tone dripping with menace as he made vague but terrifying threats. You think you're so smart, don't you? He sneered once, pinning me against a wall. Maybe I'll teach you some respect. I was 14 then, too scared to scream and too embarrassed to tell anyone what had happened. My only refuge was my father, who saw Brandon for what he really was. Stay away from him, my dad warned me one night after noticing the way I flinched when Brandon entered a room. If he ever tries anything, you come to me. I'll handle it. My father was the one person who truly had my back, and for a while, his presence kept Brandon in check. But when my dad passed away unexpectedly when I was 16, that fragile shield disappeared. Suddenly, it was just me, my mother, and Brandon, a toxic triangle where I was the perpetual target. Brandon's torment escalated after my father's death. He started showing up in my room uninvited, rifling through my things under the guise of borrowing something. He'd laugh when I protested, saying, "Relax, it's not like you have anything worth stealing." At night, I'd lie awake, terrified he'd come back while I was sleeping. My mother's response to all of this was infuriatingly consistent: denial. "Brandon's just trying to connect with you," she'd say whenever I mustered the courage to complain. "You're too sensitive. Maybe if you were nicer to him, he'd stop teasing you." Her words made me feel like I was the problem, like my fear and anger were overreactions. But deep down, I knew the truth. She didn't care about my pain. She was too invested in the narrative that Brandon was her perfect son to acknowledge the damage he was causing. The day I turned 18, I packed my bags and left. I didn't have a plan, just a burning need to escape. My mother didn't try to stop me. "You'll come crawling back," she said, her tone cold and dismissive. "You're just being dramatic." I spent the next several years rebuilding my life, piecing together some semblance of normalcy far away from her and Brandon. But no matter how far I ran, it seemed like they always found a way to drag me back into their chaos. For years, I kept my distance from my mother and Brandon. I thought I was safe. I'd built a life for myself, a small apartment, a decent job, and a circle of friends who had become my chosen family. My mother was nothing more than a ghost in the background, an occasional name that popped up on my phone screen when I ignored her calls. Brandon? I didn't even think about him anymore, at least not consciously. Then, one evening, my phone buzzed with her name flashing across the screen. I stared at it for a moment, debating whether to answer. Against my better judgment, I picked up. "Hellos. Hi, sweethearts." My mother's voice was unnervingly chipper, like we were close friends catching up. "What do you want?" I asked flatly, cutting straight to the point. She sighed dramatically. "Is that any way to talk to your mother?" "I was just thinking it's been too long since we've seen each other. You know, family is everything. Don't you miss us?" "No," I said without hesitation. The conversation should have ended there, but she wasn't letting me off that easily. She started rambling about how she and Brandon were doing, slipping in little guilt-laden comments about how I'd abandoned them. I barely listened, my eyes drifting to the clock as I waited for her to get to the point. And then she dropped the bombshell. "I want you to marry Brandon," she said, her tone casual, as if she were suggesting a new recipe for dinner. At first, I thought I must have misheard her. "What?" "Brandon adores you," she continued, unfazed by my disbelief. He's been so lonely since his last relationship ended. You two would make such a beautiful couple. It's time to bring our family back together. I gripped the phone so hard my knuckles turned white. You've got to be kidding me, I said, my voice shaking with anger. I'm completely serious, she replied, her tone maddeningly calm. You're not getting any younger, and neither is he. Besides, it's what your father would have wanted. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. My father despised Brandon and made no secret of it. Don't you dare bring Dad into this, I snapped. But my mother wasn't done. She launched into a bizarre monologue about how this would unite the family and how I owed it to her to keep the family intact. Her words were so rehearsed, so detached from reality, that it felt like I was speaking to a stranger. When I finally found my voice, I reminded her, no, I screamed at her, that Brandon's actions had left me unable to have children, a consequence of his abuse that I still struggled to even talk about. Her response? You can always adopt, she said breezily, as if that erased the trauma and devastation I'd endured. I hung up on her, shaking with rage and disbelief. My hands trembled as I set the phone down, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely think. I couldn't believe her audacity. After everything Brandon had done to me, she wanted me to marry him? To build a beautiful life with the man who had stolen so much from me? But that call was just the beginning. My mother wasn't going to let this go. In the days that followed, she bombarded me with texts, voicemails, and even emails, all filled with the same twisted logic. She painted Brandon as a misunderstood saint and me as the selfish, ungrateful daughter refusing to do what was right for the family. Each message chipped away at my resolve, not because I was tempted to give in, but because it reminded me of how little she valued me as a person. To her, I wasn't her daughter. I was a pawn in her warped vision of what our family should be. I thought about blocking her, but something stopped me. Part of me wanted to know what she'd do next, how far she'd go. I didn't have to wait long to find out. The first few days after that phone call, I tried to convince myself it was over. My mother's demands were so outrageous, so out of touch with reality, that surely even she would realize how insane she sounded. But I underestimated her persistence and her capacity for cruelty. The calls started immediately. At first, they were concerned. Her voicemails were filled with phrases like, I know this is a lot to process, and I'm only thinking of what's best for you. But when I didn't respond, her tone shifted. You can't ignore me forever, one voicemail began, her voice sharp with frustration. You're being ridiculous. I'm your mother, and you owe me a conversation. Brandon deserves to be heard. By the end of the week, the voicemails had escalated into outright threats. If you keep shutting me out, she hissed in one particularly chilling message, don't expect me to protect you when you need help. And you will need help, believe me. I blocked her number, hoping that would put an end to it, but my mother wasn't the type to give up easily. A few days later, I came home after a long day at work and froze. She was sitting on the steps outside my apartment building, a stack of photo albums in her lap. What are you doing here? I demanded, staying a safe distance away. She looked up, her expression a twisted mix of sweetness and determination. I just want to talk, she said, patting the spot next to her as if we were about to have a cozy chat. I brought these to remind you of how much we mean to each other. I stayed rooted in place, my skin crawling as I watched her flip through the pages. There were photos of me as a child, grinning toothlessly at the camera, and a few of us together, ones I didn't even remember being taken. She pointed to one of me in a Halloween costume, clutching a plastic pumpkin full of candy. Look how happy you were, she said softly, as if she were reminiscing about a perfect childhood instead of the nightmare it had actually been. I don't want to do this, I said, my voice shaking. You need to leave. But she ignored me, her fingers tracing the edges of another photo. We were so close once. I don't know why you're so determined to push me away. Her words made my blood boil. Maybe it's because you're trying to force me to marry my abuser, I snapped. Does that ring a bell? Her face hardened, and for a moment, I thought she might lash out. But instead, she smiled, a cold, calculated smile that made my stomach turn. You've always been so dramatic, she said. Brandon loves you, and I know, deep down you love him too. You just need to let go of this anger. I felt like I was going to be sick. If you don't leave, I'll call the police, I said, my voice rising. That got her attention. Her expression darkened, and she slowly stood, the photo albums clutched tightly in her arms. Fine, she said, her voice low and venomous. But you'll regret this. She shoved a letter into my hand before walking away, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. I didn't read the letter right away. I was too shaken, too angry. I tossed it onto my kitchen counter and spent the rest of the evening pacing my apartment, trying to calm down. But later that night, as I sat alone in the dark, curiosity got the better of me. The letter was worse than I could have imagined. It was filled with twisted sentiments about how Brandon adores me and how I was being cruel for rejecting him. My mother wrote that he wanted to raise a child with me, conveniently ignoring the fact that his actions had taken that possibility away from me. She talked about how this was my chance to redeem the family and how I was being selfish by clinging to the past. Reading it made my skin crawl. It wasn't just her words, it was the sheer audacity, the way she twisted reality to suit her narrative. To her, Brandon's abuse didn't matter. My trauma didn't matter. All that mattered was her vision of a perfect family, no matter how warped it was. I knew then that I couldn't handle this on my own. I needed help, and I needed it fast. In the middle of the chaos with my mother and her relentless campaign to force me into a marriage with Brandon, a financial hiccup turned into a full-blown revelation. I'd been trying to shore up my defenses, seeking legal advice, looking into restraining orders, and making sure my accounts and assets were secure. That's when I remembered my father's inheritance. My dad had been a careful man, meticulous with money, and protective of me in ways my mother never was. Before his death, he'd set up a modest trust in my name, a safety net for my future. He'd explained it to me when I was younger, assuring me it was untouchable until I came of age. I hadn't thought much about it since then. Life had been too chaotic, and I'd always assumed the money was safely waiting for me if I ever needed it. But when I tried to access the account, the bank informed me that the funds had been withdrawn years ago. The account was empty. I was stunned. My father was meticulous to a fault. There was no way he'd have let the money vanish without a clear explanation. Something was wrong, and I couldn't let it go. I began digging through old documents, anything I could find that might shed light on what happened. I even reached out to a lawyer, a family friend of David's, who helped me comb through the paperwork. What we found made my stomach churn. My mother had emptied the account less than a year after my father died. She'd labeled the withdrawals as family expenses, but there was no documentation to back it up. No receipts, no clear purpose. Just tens of thousands of dollars gone, siphoned away into her personal accounts. When I confronted her, I expected denial or at least a half-hearted excuse. What I got was far worse. "Oh, that," she said casually, her tone dismissive. "That money was for the family. I needed it to take care of things after your father passed. You know how hard things were back then." My hands shook as I stared at her, trying to process the audacity of her words. "That money wasn't yours," I said, my voice trembling with rage. "It was mine. Dad left it for me." She rolled her eyes, as if I were being unreasonable. "Don't be dramatic. You're doing fine without it. Look at you, you've got a job, an apartment. You don't need it like we did." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You stole from me," I spat, the anger rising in my chest. "Do you even hear yourself? That money was supposed to help me build a future. You had no right." She sighed, as if I were the one being unreasonable. "I'm your mother," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "I did what I had to do for the family. Besides, you'll get it back eventually if you stop acting so selfish and start thinking about what's best for all of us." It didn't take a genius to figure out what she meant. Marry Brandon, and she'd consider giving me what was rightfully mine. The manipulation was so blatant, so calculated, that it left me speechless. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at her, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. I wanted to scream, to throw something, to make her understand the depth of what she'd done. But I knew it wouldn't matter. She'd twisted reality to suit her narrative, and no amount of yelling would change that. I walked away, leaving her standing there with her smug expression and her infuriating justifications. But as I left, I made a silent promise to myself. I wasn't going to let her win. Over the next few days, I worked with the lawyer to explore my options. Recovering the inheritance wouldn't be easy. It was clear my mother had spent most of it, and what little remained would require a legal battle to reclaim. But I was determined. This wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about taking back the power she'd stolen from me, about drawing a line in the sand and refusing to let her continue to control my life. As I prepared for what was sure to be a grueling fight, one thought kept me going. I wasn't that scared, helpless teenager anymore. I was stronger now. And I wasn't going to let her or Brandon destroy what little peace I'd managed to find. I'd always thought of my job as a safe space. As a receptionist at a small clinic, I spent my days scheduling appointments, greeting patients, and managing paperwork. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady, predictable, and free from the chaos of my family's drama. Or at least it used to be. That changed one rainy Tuesday afternoon. I was in the middle of checking in a patient when a woman stepped into the waiting room. She was wearing oversized sunglasses and a scarf wrapped around her head, but there was something unsettlingly familiar about her posture, the way she held herself. "Hello, I'm here for my appointment," she said, her voice sickly sweet. I froze, my hand hovering over the keyboard. My heart sank as recognition dawned. It was my mother. I didn't acknowledge her right away, hoping I could somehow get through this without a scene. "What's your name?" I asked, my tone deliberately neutral. "Margaret Black," she replied with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I swallowed hard. She wasn't even trying to be subtle, using an obvious fake name to get past the front desk. My fingers hovered over the phone, debating whether to call security, but before I could act, she leaned in close, lowering her voice. "We need to talk," she hissed. I straightened, my voice clipped. "You can't be here. This is my workplace." Ignoring me completely, she raised her voice and launched into a tirade. "You're tearing this family apart with your selfishness. Do you even care what you're doing to us?" To Brandon. Heads turned. Patients in the waiting room began whispering, their eyes darting between us. I felt my face flush with humiliation as she continued, her words sharp and unrelenting. "Do you know how much Brandon has sacrificed for you? For this family? And this is how you repay us? You're brainwashed. That's the only explanation for how cruel you've become." I wanted to shrink into the floor, but I forced myself to stand my ground. "You need to leave," I said through gritted teeth. "Right now." Before she could respond, my boss, Dr. Patel, emerged from her office. She took one look at the situation and immediately stepped in. "Excuse me, ma'am," Dr. Patel said, her voice firm but polite. "You're causing a disturbance. I'm going to have to ask you to leave." My mother turned her attention to Dr. Patel, her expression morphing into mock innocence. "I'm just trying to have a conversation with my daughter. This is a private matter." Dr. Patel didn't flinch. "This is a professional environment, and you're disrupting our patients. If you don't leave, I'll have to call security." My mother hesitated, her mouth opening and closing as if she were deciding whether to argue. Finally, she turned back to me, her face hardening. "You can't ignore me forever," she said, her voice low but venomous. She pulled an envelope from her bag and thrust it into my hands. "Read this. Maybe it'll knock some sense into you." With that, she spun on her heel and stormed out, leaving a room full of stunned patients and staff in her wake. That night, I sat on my couch, the envelope clutched in my hands. Part of me wanted to toss it in the trash without reading it, but another part, the part still desperate to understand how she could be this twisted, couldn't resist. The letter was even more disturbing than the last. In it, my mother accused me of being brainwashed by my father's side of the family, claiming that they'd poison me against her and Brandon. She described Brandon as the only person who could save me, insisting that he was the key to restoring our family's happiness. There was a section about how I owed her for raising me, for all the sacrifices she'd made, and that marrying Brandon was the only way to repay her. The rest of the letter was a jumble of emotional manipulation, guilt-tripping, and outright delusion. I called my half-brother David, sobbing so hard I could barely get the words out. Mom showed up at my work. I managed to choke out. She caused a scene in front of everyone and handed me another letter. It's insane, David. I don't know what to do." David was furious. "She's completely unhinged," he said, his voice tight with anger. "This has gone too far. You don't have to deal with this alone, okay? We'll fight this together." He and his wife, Sarah, had been my rock through this nightmare, and once again, they stepped up. David offered to help me find a lawyer to not only fight for my inheritance, but to protect myself from further harassment. For the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. I wasn't alone in this. And with their support, I knew I could stand my ground, no matter how relentless my mother became. I thought I'd seen the worst of Brandon. I thought his cruelty, his manipulation, and his blatant disregard for others couldn't surprise me anymore. But I was wrong. It was a quiet evening when David called, his voice tight with urgency. "You're not going to believe this," he said. "Brandon's in jail." My stomach dropped. "What happened?" He took a deep breath, clearly trying to steady himself. He kidnapped a relative's 2-year-old daughter. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap.
What?
I finally managed to say, barely able to process it. Apparently, he just took her, David continued, his voice tinged with disgust. He claimed it was family bonding time, but the parents had no idea where she was. They called the police, and they found him with her at a motel an hour away. Thank God the child's unharmed. But, Jesus, your name. This is who he really is. I sat in stunned silence, gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. My chest tightened with a mix of fear, anger, and something darker, a sickening sense of validation. This was the real Brandon, laid bare for the world to see. The news sent ripples through the family. Relatives who had once defended Brandon now whispered behind closed doors, their loyalty shaken. But unsurprisingly, my mother remained steadfast in her delusions. When I called her, hoping against all odds that this would finally open her eyes, her response left me speechless. "He's misunderstood," she said dismissively, her tone almost annoyed, as if the arrest were a minor inconvenience. "Misunderstood?" I snapped, my voice trembling with rage. "He kidnapped a child, Mom. How do you misunderstand that?" "He didn't mean any harm," she insisted. "Brandon loves children. He was probably just trying to give her a nice day out, and now everyone's blowing it out of proportion. People love to vilify him because they don't understand him the way I do." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Do you even hear yourself? He took someone else's child without permission. That's a crime, Mom. A serious crime. He's your brother," she said sharply, as if that was supposed to make it all okay. "And I won't abandon him when the world turns against him. Unlike you." Her words cut deep, but I refused to let them break me. "This isn't about loyalty," I said, my voice cold. "It's about right and wrong. And if you can't see that, then I don't know what to tell you." I hung up, shaking with fury and disbelief. No matter what Brandon did, no matter how vile or unforgivable his actions were, my mother would always find a way to justify them. It was as if her entire identity was wrapped up in defending him, no matter the cost. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions. I couldn't stop thinking about the little girl he'd taken, the fear she must have felt, and the sheer audacity it took for him to believe he had the right to do something like that. It was a stark reminder of just how dangerous he was, not just to me, but to anyone who crossed his path. David called again a few days later with an update. "He's being held without bail," he said. "The parents are pressing charges, and it looks like it's going to court. This might actually stick." I should have felt relieved, maybe even hopeful that justice was finally catching up with him. But all I felt was exhaustion. The years of fear, the endless battles, the constant weight of my family's toxicity, it all came crashing down on me. But one thing was clear. If my mother could excuse even this, then there was no saving her. And there was no saving whatever fragile threads of a relationship we had left. This time, I wouldn't let them pull me back in. The decision to fight for my inheritance wasn't just about the money. It was about reclaiming the control my mother and Brandon had stolen from me for so many years. When David suggested filing a legal case, I hesitated at first. The thought of dragging this fight into a courtroom felt overwhelming, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized I couldn't let them get away with it. David's lawyer, a sharp and tenacious woman named Linda, laid out the situation clearly. "This won't be easy," she said during our first meeting. "Your mother is likely to fight tooth and nail, and given how long ago the money was taken, there's a chance she'll argue the statute of limitations." "But she stole it," I said, the frustration boiling under my skin. "My father set that money aside for me. It was supposed to be mine." Linda nodded. "And we'll make that argument. But you need to prepare yourself. This won't be a quick process, and it's going to get ugly." She wasn't wrong. The court filings triggered an immediate backlash. My mother responded with venom, sending me text messages that ranged from guilt-tripping to outright threats. "After everything I've done for you, this is how you repay me? Dragging me to court? You're pathetic." David urged me to block her, but I couldn't bring myself to do it just yet. Part of me wanted to see how far she would go, how deep her desperation ran. She filed a counterclaim, arguing that the inheritance rightfully belonged to her because she'd used it to support the family after my father's death. Linda wasn't fazed. "Her argument is weak," she said during one of our strategy meetings. "She'll have a hard time proving that those funds were used for family expenses, especially with no documentation to back it up." But the lack of documentation didn't stop my mother from spinning her own narrative. She painted herself as the victim, claiming I was an ungrateful daughter trying to ruin her life. She even tried to drag Brandon into the case, suggesting that his love and support were the reasons I'd had any stability growing up. The audacity of it all left me speechless. The court hearings were grueling. Sitting across from my mother, listening to her twist the truth and play the victim, was like reliving every fight we'd ever had, magnified 1,000 times. She sobbed on the stand, clutching a tissue as she talked about how hard it had been to raise me after my father's death. "I did the best I could," she said, her voice trembling with feigned sincerity. "I used that money to keep a roof over our heads and food on the table. I didn't think she'd hold it against me like this." I wanted to scream, to stand up and shout the truth, that she'd spent that money on herself and Brandon, not me. That she'd always prioritized him over me, no matter the cost. But Linda's hand on my arm kept me grounded. "Let her dig her own grave," she whispered. When it was my turn to testify, I told the truth, the whole, unvarnished truth. I talked about how my father had set up the inheritance to ensure I had a future, how I discovered it was gone when I tried to access it, and how my mother had admitted to taking it without remorse. "It wasn't just about the money," I said, my voice steady despite the lump in my throat. "It was about control. My mother has always used whatever leverage she can to manipulate me, and this inheritance was just another tool in her arsenal. Having David and Sarah by my side made all the difference. They sat through every hearing, offering quiet encouragement and unwavering support. During breaks, David would remind me why we were doing this. "You're not just fighting for the money," he said one day, handing me a bottle of water. "You're fighting to take back your power. Don't let her win." The case is still ongoing, dragging through the slow churn of the legal system, but I'm determined to see it through. Every hearing, every document filed, every grueling cross-examination is a reminder of why I can't back down. This isn't just about reclaiming what's mine. It's about drawing a line in the sand and refusing to let my mother and Brandon control me any longer. No matter how long it takes, I refuse to let them win. For as long as I can remember, my mother's greatest skill has been manipulating the narrative. No matter the situation, she always found a way to cast herself as the victim, the martyr who did everything for her family and got nothing in return. For years, she wielded that narrative like a weapon, rallying relatives to her side and isolating me further. But after Brandon's arrest and the legal battle over my inheritance, the cracks in her facade have started to show. It began with whispered phone calls. My aunt, one of the few family members who'd maintained any sort of neutral stance, called me late one night, her voice heavy with regret. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't know everything that was going on. Your mother always made it seem like you were the problem, but after what Brandon did, I can't defend her anymore." I didn't know how to respond. For years, I'd been screaming into the void, trying to make people see the truth, and now that they were finally listening, all I felt was exhaustion. The tide turned quickly after that. Other family members began reaching out, some tentatively, others with tearful apologies. My cousin Rebecca, who'd once dismissed my concerns about Brandon as family drama, sent a long, rambling text confessing that she'd been wrong. "I didn't understand back then," she wrote. "But now I see what you were going through. I'm so sorry for not believing you." Even my uncle, my mother's older brother, and one of her most staunch supporters, called me, his tone filled with quiet shame. "I should have stepped in years ago," he admitted. "Your father would have wanted me to. I didn't want to get involved. And that was wrong." While part of me appreciated their apologies, another part couldn't help but feel bitter. Where were these people when I was a scared teenager, desperately trying to escape Brandon's torment? Where were they when my mother was gaslighting me, stealing from me, and turning the family against me? Their sudden change of heart felt too little, too late. Meanwhile, my mother's hold on the family was unraveling. For the first time, people were questioning her motives, her stories, her unrelenting defense of Brandon. At family gatherings, which I still avoided but heard about through David, her usual tactics weren't landing. She tried to spin Brandon's arrest as a misunderstanding, but no one was buying it. He just wanted to spend time with her, she'd insist, her voice laced with indignation. He didn't do anything wrong. But the more she defended him, the more people began to see her for who she really was. My aunt later told me about one particular gathering where my mother exploded in frustration after several relatives challenged her narrative. "They don't understand," my mother had snapped, her voice trembling with rage. "Brandon's the only one who truly cares about me. If they can't see that, then they're the problem." It was a chilling moment, One that solidified for many what I'd been saying all along. Her obsession with Brandon wasn't just unhealthy, it was dangerous. Despite the shift in the family dynamic, I couldn't shake the damage that had already been done. Years of isolation, manipulation, and abuse had left scars that I wasn't sure would ever fully heal. Even now, with more people on my side than ever before, I still felt a deep sense of mistrust. What if they only believed me because Brandon's actions were too blatant to ignore? Would they have taken my side if the evidence hadn't been so undeniable? I struggled with those questions as I navigated this new reality. My mother's campaign against me had backfired spectacularly, but the victory felt hollow. I wasn't the same person I'd been before all of this started. I'd lost years of my life to their toxicity, and while I was finally starting to rebuild, I didn't know if I'd ever fully recover. Some wounds run too deep, and no amount of validation or apologies can erase the pain of being abandoned when you needed people most. But even so, I was determined to keep moving forward. For the first time in years, the weight of my mother's influence was starting to lift. And while I wasn't sure what the future held, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going back. It had been weeks since I'd heard from my mother directly. The legal battle was still trudging along, and Brandon's arrest had silenced most of her usual tirades. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe without her shadow looming over me. Then the letter came. It was a chilly evening, and I'd just gotten home from work when I found the envelope on my doorstep. There was no return address, but I knew the handwriting instantly, her loopy cursive that I hadn't seen since childhood, back when she'd write me notes to excuse me from school or leave shopping lists on the kitchen counter. For a moment, I just stared at it, debating whether to open it. Part of me wanted to tear it up right there, to refuse her yet another opportunity to get under my skin. But curiosity won out. The tone of the letter caught me off guard. It wasn't the usual barrage of accusations and demands. Instead, it was softer, almost pleading. Dear your name. I know you don't want to hear from me, but I need you to understand how much I miss you. Things have been so hard without you in my life. I feel lost, like I'm not myself anymore. You were always my little girl, my reason for everything, and it hurts so much to see what's happened to us. She went on to reminisce about my childhood, painting a rosy picture of moments I barely remembered. She mentioned the Halloween costumes she'd made for me, the bedtime stories she used to read, the way I'd cling to her leg when I was too shy to talk to strangers. I made mistakes, she admitted near the end, though she didn't specify what those mistakes were. But everything I did out of love. I just wanted what was best for you, even if it didn't always come across that way. Please, let's put the past behind us. I want to be a family again. By the time I finished reading, my hands were trembling. The letter was carefully crafted, designed to tug at my heartstrings and reignite the part of me that still craved a mother's love. For hours, I sat on the couch, staring at the letter, my emotions swirling in a chaotic storm. Part of me wanted to believe her words, to take them at face value, and convince myself that maybe, just maybe, she'd finally realized the damage she'd caused. But then I thought about everything she'd done. The lies, the manipulation, the years of siding with Brandon no matter how much he hurt me. I thought about her showing up at my workplace, causing a scene in front of my coworkers and patients. I thought about her stealing my inheritance and defending Brandon even after he kidnapped a child. Could someone like that really change? The logical part of me knew the answer. This wasn't an apology, it was a tactic. She was losing control, and this letter was her way of clawing back into my life. But the emotional part of me, the part that still carried the scars of abandonment, wanted so badly to believe that she meant it. I called David that night, unsure of what to do. She wrote me a letter, I said, my voice shaky. What does it say? He asked. I read it to him, pausing occasionally to steady my breathing. When I finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. She knows exactly what she's doing, David said finally. She's playing on your emotions because she thinks it'll work. And honestly, I think she's scared. Her grip on you is slipping, and she knows it. But what if she's serious? I asked, my voice small. What if she really is changed? David sighed. People like her don't change. Your name. Not without real consequences. She's only saying what she thinks you want to hear. If you let her back in, she'll just hurt you again. You know that. Deep down, I did know it. But the pain of severing ties with my mother wasn't something I could easily shake. No matter how toxic she was, part of me still yearned for the relationship I'd always wanted, but never had. For now, the letter sits unopened on my desk, its words etched into my mind. I don't know if I'll respond. I don't know if I'll ever be ready to face her again. All I know is that I can't let her pull me back into her orbit. Not when I've fought so hard to break free. The letter still sits on my desk, its edges curling slightly from being handled so many times. I haven't responded, and I don't think I will. But it's there, a constant reminder of the tangled web of emotions I can't seem to escape. As I sit in my small apartment, the quiet hum of the city outside, I feel the weight of everything I've endured pressing down on me. The years of manipulation, the lies, the betrayals, it's a heavy burden, one that no amount of time seems to lighten. I've fought so hard to escape their control, to carve out a life that's mine, free from their toxic influence. But they still haunt me, even from a distance. I think about my mother more often than I'd like to admit. Not the mother she is now, but the one I used to hope she could be. I think about the times when I was little, when her smile felt genuine and her hugs felt safe. I wonder if those moments were real or just figments of a child's imagination, desperate to believe in the illusion of love. Then I remember all the ways she chose Brandon over me, all the excuses she made for his behavior, all the times she looked the other way when I needed her most. I think about how she emptied my inheritance without a second thought, how she tried to manipulate me into marrying the man who caused me so much pain. Some wounds cut too deep to heal. I don't know if I'll ever forgive her. I don't know if I'll ever forgive Brandon. But forgiveness isn't my priority right now. Survival is. Every day, I wake up and take another step forward. I go to work, I meet with Linda about the legal case, I call David and Sarah when the loneliness feels too heavy to bear. Slowly, I'm rebuilding a life that feels like mine, not one shaped by my mother's expectations or Brandon's shadow, but one I can claim as my own. The future feels uncertain, and sometimes that terrifies me. There are days when I wonder if I'll ever fully escape their influence, if I'll ever stop looking over my shoulder or second-guessing myself. But for now, I'm focusing on the small victories. I've learned to set boundaries, to stand up for myself, to say no when it matters most. That alone feels like progress.